This week on the Crossroads Suncast, we took a look at the move to bring a Major League Baseball team to Nashville, Tennessee. We found an effort to build a more complete history of baseball, pulling together the historically segregated Negro Leagues into the modern story of the sport. As part of the process of learning more, we interviewed Bob Kendrick, president of the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum in Kansas City, Missouri. It's an incredible conversation, with so many moments we couldn't fit into the episode. That's why we're releasing it in full. I'm Bryce Patterson. Here's Senior Executive Producer Morgan Riegel's interview with Bob Kendrick. We'll start with Kendrick reflecting on the role of the museum.
If you are a fan of American history, you're going to love this story. If you are a fan of the underdog overcoming adversity to go on to greatness, then you're going to love this story. Now, if you are a baseball fan to boot, well, you're in hog heaven, because it combines the best of all those worlds. But at the crux of this is this wonderful piece of baseball and Americana that very few of us ever knew even existed, no less the magnitude in which it did exist. And so, as you guys could well imagine, for my visitors, this is an awakening. Yeah, they had no idea. As my late mother would say, you don't know what you don't know. And the common thread that I hear from those who walk through our museum, and you will hear this over and over. I didn't know that. I didn't know that. Of course you didn't know. You had no way to know. And honestly, guys, I don't think there was ever a time that people didn't want to know about the Negro Leagues. They just had no way to know about the Negro Leagues until this museum emerged, because essentially American historians did us all a tremendous disservice. They kept this piece of baseball and Americana away from us. So countless generations of us went through our own formal educations, again, without knowing one of the most significant chapters, not in baseball, but American history, and that's the rich, compelling, inspirational story of the Negro Leagues.
Yeah, that's kind of what I've discovered as I've gotten through this story is just how much history. I'm a huge baseball fan, but all of it, a lot of this was new to me. I know Jackie Robinson, everybody knows the Jackie Robinson story, but like just how far and deep like the Negro Leagues, the history goes is just really fascinating to me.
It is fascinating, and as I like to describe it, it is fascinatingly complicated. Yeah, because the Negro Leagues, we used to have a video that we ran that was narrated by the great voice of former CNN anchorman Bernard Shaw. And in the film, he says, you might say that the Negro Leagues were so good that they put themselves out of business. Yeah.
Oh, that's remarkable to me. Yeah, but it's so well summed up that you couldn't keep them out of Major League Baseball, right? Or better,
Yeah, you couldn't keep that talent out. And Major League Baseball realized that. And they started to pluck that talent away from the Negro Leagues. But as you can well imagine, once you start siphoning that talent out and there was no replenishing system, then the Negro Leagues had no choice but to dissolve. They disbanded. Uh-huh.
Tell me a little bit about, let's just kind of go back to the beginning. Who are you? What is your involvement with the Negro Leagues? How did you get on board? And why is this, personal for you? Why is this, something you were super?
And it is. And you're absolutely right. It is personal. I'm Bob Kendrick. I'm the president of the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum. I've served now as president for the last 14 years. I became president in 2011. But my affiliation with this organization, believe it or not, goes all the way back to 1993 as a volunteer. I started volunteering for this organization in 1993 when I walked into what was then a one-room office here at historic 18th and Vine, inside the Lincoln Building, right across the street from where my office is now. I walked into a one-room office that was the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum, and little did I know that I had literally, guys, just walked into what would become my passion. I fell in love with this fledgling museum, and I fell in love with its mission and the amazing athletes who made this story. And honestly, it was their spirits, the spirit of those players, that really consumed me. Because most people would agree with me. Had they been bitter about the things that transpired in their lives as they were trying to play baseball in this country, I think every one of us would have said you had every right to be bitter. But to a player that I've ever met, not one of them harbored any bitterness or expressed any ill will toward anyone who may have attempted to perpetrate something against them as they were traveling the highways and byways of this country to play baseball. And I just found that to be such an incredible, endearing spirit. And it took me a little while to really grasp how this could be. Well, guys, they were never going to be bitter about baseball. Yeah, no, no, they knew how good their league was. They knew how good they were. And quite frankly, the major leaguers knew how good they were. They played countless exhibition games against one another, and the record books bear out that the Negro League teams or the Black All Star teams won the majority of those head to head matchups. So, no, they were never going to be bitter about baseball. Did they like the things that happened to them as they traveled and how travel the highways and byways of this country? Of course not. If you could imagine this, they could ride into a town, fill up the ballpark, but yet not be able to get something to eat from the same fans who had just cheered them, or not have a place to stay. So, yes, they would sleep on the bus and eat their peanut butter and crackers until they could get to a place that might provide them basic services. But as I tell my guests, what you have to admire about this story, they never allowed that set of social circumstances to kill their love of the game. Their spirits were such that if I've got to sleep on the bus and if I've got to eat my peanut butter and crackers, I'm going to keep playing ball. And really, that's the prevailing spirit that you feel when you walk through the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum. I know that there are those who come here thinking that it's going to be a sad samba kind of story. You got the wrong place because it's not. It is a celebration. It is a celebration of the power of the human spirit to persevere and prevail based on one small, simple principle. You won't let me play with you in the major leagues, then I will create a league of my own. Yeah, and when you stop to think about that, that is the American way. And so while America tried to prevent them from playing, the American spirit is what allowed them to persevere and prevail. What's not to love about that kind of story? So now I'm falling deeper in love with this story. But guys, I never thought, I never dreamt that it would turn into a career. And to be honest, one of the most gratifying things I think I could have ever done, either personally or professionally. In 1997, I became the museum's first director of marketing. Actually, 1998, I became the museum's first director of marketing, served in that role for about 12 years. I left briefly as vice president of marketing for the museum. 13 months later, I came back being introduced as the president. So again, you go from being a volunteer to now trying to lead this great institution. So it's been an amazing journey for me.
I feel like for you, you like even relate more to this because, they started from the ground up, they were the volunteers, and then now look where they are now. How do you personally relate to their story of, starting something from a one room museum to
Exactly.
hands filled with the state?
And I think that's the thing because this museum is so grassroots. It is as grassroots an institution as you will ever encounter. The guys who organized this museum was a group of former Negro League players led by the great Buck O'Neill. And guys, they literally took turns paying the monthly rent to keep the little office open. And as I like to say, with it, our hopes and dreams of someday building a facility that would pay tribute to this wonderful chapter of baseball in American history. And but they had a dream and they had a passion behind that dream. And that is what has propelled us to this point where we moved into our new home in November of 1997. We went from that one room office to today about 10,000 square feet of exhibit space. So it's not an overwhelmingly large footprint, but within those 10,000 square feet of space is a lot of information. And along that journey, we are now recognized as America's national Negro Leagues Baseball Museum, as deemed and designated so by the United States Congress. And of course, we just recently announced plans to build a brand new 30 plus thousand square foot Negro Leagues Baseball Museum right around the corner from where we operate now. It will be anchored right next to the Paseo YMCA, which coincidentally is the birthplace of the Negro Leagues. That is where the Negro Leagues were established on February 13th, 1920, in an old historic African American YMCA. We have now renovated that building. It is going to become the home of the Buck O'Neill Education and Research Center, and then we'll build a new museum adjacent to that historic landmark, creating what I call the nation's first Negro Leagues campus as the gateway into historic 18th and Vine here in Kansas City, and an international headquarters for both black baseball and social history. That's a long way, man, from that one room office. So, there's an inherent amount of pride associated anytime you can do something that everybody else thought you couldn't do. And you're right, it absolutely mimics the rise of the Negro Leagues. There were so many naysayers who thought that the Negro Leagues would never last. Well, it operated for 40 years. Uh-huh. It operated for 40 years and it ultimately changed the way this game was played. Well, the same naysayers, or certainly naysayers, were saying the same thing about this museum. Oh, there's no way a museum will survive. A little startup museum, it won't make it, and particularly there at historic 18th and Vine, which once upon a time had been a very proud, prominent African American community during that era of American segregation. But like a lot of urban areas, it had died. And it had basically been left abandoned. And here comes a fledgling Negro Leagues Museum saying, we're going to build a museum here. So, as you can well imagine, some of our most ardent supporters are questioning the decision. And I can understand why, because they're questioning who's going to come see you. There was no built in foot traffic, and this area, in the minds of so many, was an unsafe area. That was the stigma associated with it. And thanks to the infinite wisdom of Buck O'Neill, who said, this is where we will build this museum. And in doing so, we will not only preserve this history, but we will resurrect a community. And that's exactly what we've done. And that was in 1990. And guys, we hadn't looked back since. And people are living and working and playing here at historic 18th and Vine again. And here we now are on the cusp of building this brand new $30+ million state of the art Negro Leagues Baseball Museum to now lead a new kind of growth of this community. And so naturally, we are very proud of what we've accomplished. We've continued to work so diligently to give Negro Leagues history a mainstream voice. And it's happening more and more. And I think the interest and awareness of Negro Leagues baseball history is at an all-time high. And we just need to ride that wave of momentum. And hopefully I can raise this $30 million so we can build this new home for us.
So I haven't been to the museum. Tell me what does the visitor get when they step inside? What are they seeing? What are they learning? What are the big takeaways that you hope that they get when they were?
Like I said, first and foremost, I'm going to tell you what you're not going to experience, and it's not a sad story. Because I do think people think that it's going to be sad because, obviously we know that this story is anchored against the ugliness of American segregation, a horrible chapter out of this country's history. But that's not the story here. The story here is what emerged out of segregation, the story of triumph and conquest. And so that's what you're going to be introduced to. We're going to take you on a very nostalgic journey back in time. You walk into an old ballpark like setting, and the first thing you see here, it is called the Field of Legends. And naturally, I'm biased, but I think it is one of the most amazing displays in any museum anywhere in the world. It features 10 life size statues of Negro League greats, and they're anchored in position as if you were playing a game. They represent 10 of the first group of Negro Leaguers to be inducted into the National Baseball Hall of Fame in Cooperstown, New York. So that's how our All Star team was chosen. On the outside looking in is the legendary Buck O'Neill, who is managing this great All Star team that we assembled. So you walk in, you peer through this chicken wire backstop, you see that incredible display, and we hope it gives you that desire that I can't wait to get out on the field, walk amongst the statues, take my pictures with the statues. But of course, here at the Negro Leagues Museum, we segregate you from the field because we wanted our visitors, particularly my school age audience, to at least remotely experience what segregation was like. So, in the case of these tremendously talented and courageous athletes, they knew they were good enough to play in the major leagues, so close to it, yet so far from it. So, from most vantage points in the museum, you can see the field, but you can't get to it. And the only way that you're allowed to take the field at the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum, you have to earn that right. And you do so by learning their story. And by the time you've bared witness to everything that they had to endure just to play baseball in this country, the very last thing that happens here is now you can take the field. And in many rights, you are now deemed worthy to walk out on the field, as I like to say, with 10 of the baddest brothers to ever play this game. And so along that journey, it is a timelined look at both baseball and American history. So you're not only able to trace the rise and fall of the Negro Leagues, but you're also able to trace the rise and fall, well, the social rise, I should say, of America simultaneously. And of course, you also see these various slices of African American culture, so you gain a perspective of the impact that Black baseball had on Black economy.
Talk to me, let's just kind of go back and talk to me about what the process was like for, Jackie Robinson was always obviously the first, but what was the process like desegregating baseball, getting him into the league, and then basically the floodgates that opened after that?
I think there were a lot of major league owners who had tinkered with the notion of integration. And if we were going to single out one event that kind of led this movement of integrating our national pastime, it would have been World War II. Yeah, World War II, you had so many young Black soldiers dying, fighting the exact same racism in another country that we were being asked to accept here at home. And that created a groundswell of sentiment that essentially said if they can die fighting for their country, why can't they play baseball in this country? And I think that gave Rickey, pun intended, the ammunition to go out and get Jackie Robinson. But there have been other owners in Major League Baseball who had tinkered with this notion, but the timing wasn't right. And I think each of those owners knew that they were going to be ostracized by their peers if they tried to make this move. But the interesting, and I talk about this being complicated, fascinatingly complicated. One of the reasons that it took so long to integrate is that Major League Baseball was making money off the Negro Leagues. You see, the Negro Leagues were renting many of those Major League Baseball teams' stadiums, and those teams were getting a percentage of the gate and likely all of the concession. And the Negro Leagues, by and large, were outdrawing those major league teams in their own stadiums. And so they didn't want to lose that source of revenue. Yeah, we a few years ago we acquired a letter that was written by then New York Yankees managing partner Larry MacPhail and the mayor of New York City, Mayor Fiorello LaGuardia, who the airport is named for.
Yeah, it's like I recognize that name.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh. He and others were putting pressure on Major League Baseball to examine his hiring practices and open his doors to those Black and brown players of the Negro Leagues. Well, the mayor put together a commission to examine integration. MacPhail was part of this commission. MacPhail pens what is now known as the MacPhail Memorandum. And in the body of the letter that he writes to the mayor, he lines out why integration is such a bad idea. But here's the interesting thing about it. There are points of validity in the letter. For instance, he would say, if we sign Negro League players, we will put the Negro Leagues out of business. He's absolutely right. That was going to be a byproduct of integration. He would go on to say that we can't just go in and take those players away from their Negro League teams because they are bound legally by contract. Again, theoretically, he is right. Now, Branch Rickey didn't think this. Branch Rickey never paid, as my late mother would say, 1 red cent for Jackie Robinson. He didn't sign Jackie Robinson away from the Kansas City Monarchs. He took Jackie Robinson away from the Kansas City Monarchs. But that's a whole nother story. But again, theoretically, he is right. But then he'd go on to say something completely asinine. He would say, those players in the Negro Leagues lack the faculties to play in our league. Now, I don't know when you had to be a Rhodes Scholar to play baseball, but that seemed to be the prevailing belief, is that those black athletes weren't smart enough to play in Major League Baseball. But here's the thing. Over 40% of the athletes who played in the Negro Leagues had some level of college education. Less than 5% of those who played in the major leagues had any college education, for the simple reason that the major leagues didn't want you to go to college. They got you right out of high school, put you into their farm system, and then you work your way to the major leagues. Well, the Negro Leagues didn't have that sophisticated farm system, so we trained on the campuses of historically black colleges and universities. They would then play those black college baseball teams and recruit a great deal of their workforce from those HBCUs, which meant they had a disproportionate number of college educated athletes in comparison to the major leagues. So that really held no real credence whatsoever. But then, guys, he gets to the crux of the matter. By the time this letter was penned near the end of 1945, the New York Yankees had made $100,000 off the Negro Leagues. Yeah, they were renting Yankee Stadium. They were renting Rupert Stadium across the river in New Jersey. And they were renting Blues Stadium here in Kansas City to the Negro Leagues. $100,000 is pretty good money right now. But $100,000 in 1945? That was a lot of money, and they didn't have to work for that. All they had to do was sign on the dotted line. So they were in no hurry to see integration because they knew that they would lose that source of revenue. And as I tell my guests, anytime they say it ain't about the money, it's always about the money.
Yeah. Talk to me about, how, okay, Jackie Robinson joins the league and, how, baseball was kind of at the forefront of cultural change in general. Talk to me more about the US history side of this for maybe it's somebody who's not a sports fan, but you can expand upon, the impact baseball had on this big cultural.
The recent controversy over Jackie's military content being removed from the Department of Defense's website gave an opportunity for us to kind of bring that history back to the forefront. Jackie's military history begins in 1942, where he's enlisted in the U.S. Army, stationed right up the road from where the Negro Leagues Museum operates today, Fort Riley, Kansas. You know who else was at Fort Riley at the same time? Joe Louis,
Okay.
heavyweight boxing champion of the world. Little bitty Fort Riley, Kansas had two of the most iconic sports figures in American sports history and civil rights icons, both stationed there at the same time. But at that time, Joe Louis was the star. Because to be the heavyweight boxing champ of the world, or the world's fastest man, those were the two most prestigious sports titles that could be held in this country. Well, at that time, Fort Riley was not admitting blacks into his officer training school program. Jackie and other African American enlistees, they had the necessary qualifications. Jackie, of course, was college educated. So he had more than the necessary qualifications, but Fort Riley just simply was not admitting blacks into its officer training school program. Well, if you know the story of Joe Louis, Joe had been doing exhibition prize fights to raise money for the armed forces. And so Joe ultimately calls in a favor, and that is how he gets his friend Jackie Robinson into officer training school. Jackie completes OTS. He's reassigned to Fort Hood in Texas. And of course, there at Fort Hood, he was court martialed from the U.S. Army for refusing to give up his seat to a white person on the bus. He would win his court martial trial and was honorably discharged. That's when he would write to Kansas City Monarchs owner J.L. Wilkinson and ask for a tryout. They try him out in Houston, Texas. He makes the team. And as I say in my podcast, I do a podcast called Black Diamonds with my friends over at SiriusXM Radio. Little did J.L. Wilkinson know he had just signed a man that was going to put him out of business. Because 5 months later, fellas, Jackie was gone. He had literally disappeared. And I was blessed to know several of his 1945 Kansas City Monarch teammates. And all of them, of course, now have passed on. But if they were with us today, they would tell you that when Jackie Robinson joined the Kansas City Monarchs, there was absolutely no fanfare surrounding him whatsoever. He was just another ball player trying to make the great Kansas City Monarchs roster. But they knew he was different than they were. And my friend, the great Buck O'Neill, would surmise it in this fashion. He would say, we had become acclimated to segregation, but not Jackie Robinson. You see, Jackie Robinson was Pasadena, California. He's UCLA. So this whole Jim Crow thing didn't sit well with him whatsoever. But beyond that, that was it, guys. 5 months later, he was gone. He had literally disappeared. His teammates had no idea where he was. And of course, we now know that he was meeting with Branch Rickey, where the two of them would make the monumental decision that he would become the chosen one to break Major League Baseball's then 6-decade-long, self-imposed color barrier. Well, here at the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum, we make the rather bold assertion that Jackie's breaking of the color barrier wasn't just a part of the civil rights movement, that it was actually the beginning of the civil rights movement. This is 1947. This is well before those more noted civil rights occurrences. You see, this is before Brown versus the Board of Education. This is before Rosa Parks' refusal to move to the back of the bus. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., as the great Buck O'Neill would so eloquently say, was merely a sophomore at Morehouse College in Atlanta, Georgia, when Jackie would sign his contract to play in the Dodgers organization. And of course, our very own President Harry S. Truman, born right up the road from where the museum operates, Independence, Missouri. He would not integrate the armed forces until a year after Jackie. So for all intensive purposes, this is what started the ball of social progress rolling in our country, baseball. And our country literally jumped on the coattail of baseball. And so while Major League Baseball had been vilified for not allowing blacks to play, when it opened its door, our country followed suit. And it speaks to the reverence that baseball held, and I still believe to a large extent still holds in our society. It was our national pastime.
Talk to me about Jackie Robinson and MLK's their relationship together. As part of, I was doing some research. I did what MLK said. Basically, I wouldn't be where I'm at if it wasn't for Jackie, and I thought that was so powerful.
It is extreme. It is that is an extremely powerful statement. And for me, it in ways kind of verifies what I've always said for those who don't believe that one individual can invoke change. you need to look no further than Jackie Robinson. Because Jackie Robinson, when he stepped out on that field as a member of the Brooklyn Dodgers, he was called everything but, as my mother would say, but a child of God when he walked out there. And when he came up to the plate, they knocked him down continuously. When he would slide into second base, he would oftentimes come up wet where the opposition had spit on him. When the opposition slid into second base, they came in spikes high, trying to cut him. They did everything imaginable to break Jackie, but Jackie would not break. You see, some of those other Negro Leaguers who had been so acclimated to segregation, they couldn't have handled the social adversity. If you'd have thrown a black cat on the field when Willie Wells walked out on the field, his natural instinct would have been pick that black cat up and throw it right back where it came from. But now the naysayers are going to say, see, I told you they couldn't handle it. But if Jackie can't play, the naysayers would have said, see, I told y'all they weren't good enough to play in our league. So Branch Rickey had a double difficult task of identifying the right person because failure was not an option on either side of the ledger. If Jackie can't take the abuse, the experiment is over. If Jackie can't play, the experiment is over. It could have been another 10, 15, 20 years or more before another black man would have gotten an opportunity to play in the major leagues. But think about this. If it's 20 years later, think about the great stars we would have missed. We'd have missed Willie Mays. We'd have missed Henry Aaron, Ernie Banks, Roy Campanella, Roberto Clemente, Bob Gibson. Can you imagine our sport without those great stars? And if you can imagine what it was like before 1947, because they didn't learn how to play baseball after 1947. They were playing great baseball well before 1947. But here's the side that I don't think a lot of people give great consideration to. Jackie wasn't playing for Jackie. He was literally and figuratively carrying 21 million black folks on his back when he walked across those lines. Because keep in mind, had he failed, an entire race of people would have failed. And that is an enormous amount of pressure for any one man to have to bear. Yeah, we were counting on him. I tell the story oftentimes. For black folks, Jackie Robinson's breaking of the color barrier carried the same level of euphoria that we saw collectively as a nation when Neil Armstrong walked on the moon. In many ways, he was our Neil Armstrong. And man, he can't fail. He can't fail. And baseball, as you know, is a game of failure. And he cannot fail because if he does, that is an indictment on an entire race of people, and he handled himself with such grace, class, and dignity in the face of tremendous social adversity and carrying the weight of an entire race of people. But Jackie never left the struggle. He never left. So after he breaks the color barrier, and Jackie was somewhat controversial because Jackie was a Republican. And black folks got mad at Jackie. So he went from being celebrated to being somewhat vilified because of his political stance. And he sided with Nixon and because Jackie felt that John F. Kennedy was being too soft on civil rights to protect the white Southern vote. And you know what? He was. But you have to understand this, particularly for black folks in the Deep South. There were going to be 3 pictures that was on the wall of almost every black person in the Deep South. You're going to have a picture of Dr. Martin Luther King, John F. Kennedy, and Jesus. And if you said anything bad about either one of them, you got hell on your hand. And so black folks were upset with Jackie. And then Jackie felt like Jackie felt like Nixon betrayed him when Dr. King went to jail there in Birmingham and he went to help get him out. And that kind of changed his perspective. But when you look at those images, there was Jackie side by side with Dr. King marching, trying to create equality in this country. And Jackie would hold jazz concerts on his Connecticut property to actually help raise money for the Southern Christian Leadership Conference during that time of the Civil Rights Movement. And all the way up until a few days before he dies, he was pushing for there to be African American leadership in Major League Baseball by way of coaches, managers, and executives. So Jackie never left the struggle. He died relatively young. He's in his 50s when he dies. And I do think that the weight of everything that he was carrying took his toll on him. Now, of course, we know that he ultimately dies of complications from diabetes, but we also know that stress really accelerates those complications. And I do think, and I asked his daughter Sharon, I said, do you think your dad really knew what he was about to walk into? Because it is so hard for me to even fathom that someone would willingly take on this role with the level of pressure that he would face. And I don't know if he knew that Black folks would feel the way that we felt about what he was doing. And it's just still hard for me to imagine anyone willingly knowing and then taking and accepting that responsibility. But it goes back to what I said. If you don't think that one individual can invoke change, all you have to do is look at Jackie Robinson. And when the greatest civil rights leader of our generation, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., says, "You made my job easier," that tells you just how dramatic that moment in time really was.
Let's talk a little bit about, Major League Baseball's push to merge the two leagues and celebrate its history. You got the stats being reinstated. Last year, you got the Rickwood Fields, you got Jack Robinson's number being retired. Talk to me about that initiative by the league to celebrate its history rather than shy away from it and say that, yeah, that was a bad part of our past, but to really celebrate it now.
Well, and that's exactly what is happening. I'm very proud, number one, of our partnership with Major League Baseball and the milestones that we've seen around Negro Leagues history that has been driven by Major League Baseball and Major League Baseball's Players Association. And those things that you referenced, those are truly milestones, and particularly the rolling of the stats of the Negro Leagues into the record books of Major League Baseball, and the long overdue acknowledgement of the Negro Leagues for exactly what we knew it to be, a major league. And this was so important. So last May 29th, this became official. And so now you see these Negro League names populated amongst the great stars of Major League Baseball's past when it was essentially all white. So now Josh Gibson is your all-time batting average career leader at 372, single season batting record of 466 in 1943. I'm going to go out on a limb and say that ain't going to be broken. Ah, or you see the names of Oscar Charleston and Turkey Stearns populating these lists. And as I told some folks, because I knew there was going to be some discourse about this, we knew this. And as I told some folks, just because Josh Gibson's name is ahead of Ty Cobb, that doesn't diminish Ty Cobb. It just speaks to how great Josh Gibson was. And so this should become a portal. It should become a gateway into deeper understanding. You should now want to go out and learn who Josh Gibson was. Who was Oscar Charleston? Who was Norman Turkey Stearns? Who was Judd Boo June Wilson? Yeah, that should be that gateway of understanding. And just because you don't know these names, that doesn't mean they couldn't play. Yeah. When I first met my friend, the late great Buck O'Neill, that's what he would always echo. He wanted everybody to know we could play, and they could play. And the fact that Major League Baseball has really elevated the awareness and the interest in Negro Leagues history has been just a welcome level of avocation on behalf of the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum and to be there at Rickwood Field for that celebrated event that was set up to honor the great Willie Mays. And as you know, he passed away 2 days before that game took place. I was there in Birmingham, but in a spiritual way, Willie Mays did exactly what he wanted to do, and that was pull together a group of Negro League players to have Negro Leagues baseball celebrated in a mainstream capacity there at a place where he was 17 years old when he walked out on that field playing for the Birmingham Black Barons. If you can imagine, a 17-year-old kid patrolling center field for the Birmingham Black Barons. And his spirit was all over that place. To see Rickwood Field transformed, it was special. It was one of the most special events that I've ever been a part of and was so proud to work with Major League Baseball on making that happen. The two teams that played there, of course, we were just tremendously honored. The Negro League players, as you can well imagine, they have taken this all in. It's not many of them left. So to see this newfound interest in what they had accomplished, not to be overly dramatic, but it adds, I think, some years to their lives. The way that they're being celebrated, the joy that it brings to them that they're no longer being ignored. Not that they were overly concerned about that, but the fact that their accomplishments are being acknowledged. And that means a great deal. And even the work that we've done with Sony on the inclusion of the Negro Leagues in the video game, MLB The Show. As you know, the biggest baseball video game in the world in 2023, for the first time, the game included Negro League players in a mode that is called storylines. And it has been one of the biggest things that this museum has ever done was the inclusion of the Negro Leagues in a video game because millions upon millions of young people and young adults are now not only learning about the Negro Leagues, but they're falling in love with the Negro Leagues because we put them in that video game. And Sony was very smart. My friends over at San Diego Studios were very smart because they could have just thrown them in the game with random statistics, but no context to who they were. Instead, they created the storyline mode. And we tell these stories about the players before you access these players and other vignettes about tidbits from the Negro Leagues, like night baseball and these things that were created in the Negro Leagues. And man, the reception has been overwhelmingly positive. And I have seen, since the inclusion of this game, I have seen scores upon scores of kids who are running to this museum now because they saw the museum in the video game and they want to meet the guy that's telling stories in the video game, me. Now, I saw myself, guys, doing a lot of things I never dreamt that I'd be in a video game. And it has just brought great joy because I do think, fellas, there's a misnomer that our children don't care about history, that young people in general don't care about history. But it is just that. It is a misnomer. But it becomes incumbent upon how history is presented to you. And so when we put it in a video game, a mode and medium in which so many young people were accustomed to engaging with, the light bulb clicked. Yeah, no, it absolutely clicked. And I get the kids coming here, man. They want to show me how Satchel did his double pump wind up, the high leg kick that he had. They want to talk about the mythical like power of Josh Gibson, but the power was real. And it just fills me with such joy because as an institution, number one, I believe every museum, the challenge for any museum is how do you establish relevancy? It is even more so important for a history museum and even more so a cultural institution like the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum. And that's been our quest to make sure that we can continue to connect this history in ways in which it will grab the hearts and the imaginations of the minds of all of our guests, but particularly our young people.
Let's talk about the stars a little bit. Talk about your partnership with, Nashville and how you guys have come together and the relationship you guys have.
I'm sure 10, 20 years from now, I'll lie and swear it was my idea, but it wasn't my idea. It was not my idea because I'd be doing just that, lying. It was the idea of my dear friend John Lord, who approached me about the notion of an expansion major league team that would be called the Nashville Stars after the old Negro Leagues team that played just briefly there. They didn't have a significant history, but they had history with the city of Nashville. And it was just a brilliant idea. And I've been working diligently with John and the other folks over at Music City Baseball to lay the foundation for the opportunity to compete for an expansion Major League Baseball team to come to Nashville. We know that Major League Baseball is going to expand. It has said that it is going to expand. We just don't know quite yet the timeline for expansion because COVID kind of set that timeline back. And then even after we came out of COVID, we had to move through a labor issue, which they got resolved. And hopefully there won't be another labor issue, but it certainly looks like it could be trending in that direction. But I hope that both baseball and the Players Association will get that resolved and we'll never see any stoppage in our game. But at some point, there will be expansion, and we can't think of a better city than Nashville. It is bursting at the seams. It is primed and it is ready. And for us, as you can well imagine, this would be the first time ever that a major league team carried the name and spirit of a Negro Leagues team. And you've already seen the licensed product that is already being produced and received so well by baseball fans for a team that right now doesn't actually exist. And people are wearing the Stars gear, and that benefits the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum. So you can imagine what would happen if this becomes a major league team, because as we think about funding for businesses, but particularly a museum, anytime that you can find a perpetual stream of revenue, oh man, that is welcome. Uh-huh. And it would just also raise the profile, the scale, the scope, and magnitude of this museum. And so I've been so deeply honored to work with John and the entire team over there at Music City Baseball on this effort to again lay that foundation, and I'm going to say when we're successful in bringing a Major League Baseball team to Nashville to see it named after the old Negro Leagues team, this is going to be a watershed moment, not just for this museum, not just for Negro Leagues history, not just for baseball history, but American history.
What do you think the Nashville Stars or any Negro League player would say about, there being a Negro League team name in Major League Baseball? What would they say if they could see, the precipice of this moment or, you say when it happens, what would they say when it happens?
I think they would be beaming with pride. Yeah, I do. Even though they knew how special their league was, they didn't really talk about it a lot. No, 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 they didn't talk about it a lot because for them, they were just playing baseball. They made their living playing baseball. Now, I think over the last 2, 3 decades, as the Negro Leagues have become more mainstream in its voice, they take such great pride of what they were a part of. They're being acknowledged. And I go back again to when I first met Buck O'Neill, way back in 1993. And one of the first questions that I posed to him was, Buck, what motivated you to want to build a Negro Leagues Baseball Museum? And his answer was succinct, but also very poignant, so that we would be remembered. He didn't want them to be forgotten. And not just for what they gave the game of baseball, but really what they gave this country. And this expansion Major League Baseball team that would carry the name of a Negro Leagues team encompasses everything that Buck O'Neill and others wanted to see happen. It puts them in a place where they won't be forgotten. It puts them right aside the work that we do here at the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum to ensure that the legacy of the Negro League plays on long after there are no other Negro League players to attest to what the greatness of this league. As you could well imagine, when we established this museum in 1990, we knew from the onset that this was a race against time. It wasn't a matter of if these players were going to be gone. It was simply a matter of when these players were going to be gone. And their story deserves to stand the test of time. Their legacy should not die when that last Negro Leaguer leaves the face of this earth. We cannot allow that to happen. The Negro Leagues Baseball Museum is here to ensure that that doesn't happen. But when you add an entity like a Major League Baseball team that is such a viable business product that is there in front of fans, and I can see this stadium already in my mind's eye, filled to capacity, game after game after game, as a reminder of baseball's heritage. That is what really excites me because I know that it will go a long way in ensuring that the legacy of the Negro Leagues plays on.
Thanks to Bob Kendrick for sitting down with us, and thank you for listening. If you'd like to learn more about the history of baseball, check out his podcast, Black Diamonds. And if you're enjoying Season 1 of the Crossroads Suncast, follow the show wherever you listen.